people. I found that they were really amazing. I pulled out all of the wills of the presidents and found out how much money they left, to whom. George Washington left an estate of $530,000.
I know, I was amazed, and that was like $30 million in those days.
It was a staggering sum of money. President Kennedy's will is fascinating. It opens with a line that really gives you gooseflesh. It says, mindful of the uncertainties of life, and then he goes on to say that life can be snuffed out at any instant.
Right, it's almost like he had a premonition of what was going to happen to him.
Also, there's a little line that catches your eye. He obviously realized Jackie spent a lot on clothes because he limits the amount of money that she's allowed to use yearly. Of course, she got around that by marrying Onassis.
Right, and she got her bundle that way.
But I went from I also wanted to look at last wishes of people. For example, the Roman poet Virgil's last wish was burn the Aeneid, which I'm sure generations of students wished.
Well, he wished he had. No, I did.
Yeah. Houdini has a wonderful opening to his will. He leaves all of the rabbits he used in disappearing acts to the children of friends. I found the will of Adolf Hitler, which is amazing, I mean, to read. And one of the things that stands out most is his major interest in the will is to establish an art museum in his hometown.
Right, with probably artifacts that he stole from everybody.
Well, he reminded you that he used to be an artist.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean, albeit whoever knows what it was. But I mean, there are things like there was a Calamity Jane, or there was a Typhoid Mary.
There was a Typhoid Mary. She was a real person. She was a walking, I mean, one-woman
epidemic.
Unfortunately, she was a cook. Had she been in any other profession, she might not have knocked people off, but every time she baked a pie or made a stew, family members died.
I know.
They eventually had to, the health department in New York had to isolate her on an island in the East River. And that's where she spent her remaining days, and journalists could interview her, but you weren't allowed to accept as much as a drink of water from her.
Oh, wow.
I also tried to look at famous last words of what did people say on their deathbeds. And my favorite is Oscar Wilde, who looked around the room and said, this wallpaper is killing me. One of us has got to go.
No.
Yeah. Or Thomas Edison, who's an interesting case. He was in a coma. He suddenly opened his eyes, and he looked across the room, and he said, it's very beautiful over there. And many people to this day claim that he had a glimpse of the afterlife.
Right.
Although his wife said he was simply looking out the window at his favorite garden.
Right, but who knows? How long? It took you 2 years to research it?
It took me about a little over a year to actually do all of the research.
How did you research it? Where did you go to? Did people say, hey, I think this is a marvelous idea, and come and look at, you know?
A lot of library work, old interesting volumes, and, you know, the bowels of libraries, and one thing tended to lead to another. From last wills and testaments, I got into I noticed the way that many doctors treated these famous people on their deathbed. Horrendous medical treatments. So I devoted an entire chapter to bygone beliefs. Not quack cures, but what legitimate established doctors did for centuries. Bleeding, bloodletting.
I know, this was...
If you had a headache, leeches all over the forehead. Menstrual cramps, leeches over the abdomen. George Washington on his deathbed, he was being bled by the doctors, blistering plasters all over his chest, and he begged them, please, just leave me alone.
Let me die.
As I say in the book, back in those days, it was better if you were poor and couldn't afford a doctor and at least died in dignity. If you had the misfortune of being wealthy or nobility and a doctor felt he had to save you, I mean, he resorted to horrendous means.
That's really, really interesting. So you did mostly, it was mostly library.
Mostly library, trying to come up with things that I don't
now, are a lot of things, a lot of wills and things in public domain?
Yes. The whole question is how to find them. And I go through a lot of history, but I don't want to give you the same things that are repeated in history books. I mean, just as a tiny example, in talking about Ulysses S. Grant, I mentioned that he's the only president known to play the role of Desdemona in Shakespeare's Othello. It was in a military production, but it's not the kind of interesting little aside that you don't get in a history book. Right. I also devoted a whole chapter to decimating diseases, the kind of epidemics and pandemics that have wiped out millions of people. What most people don't realize is one of the largest was not the bubonic plague, but the influenza in 1918 in our country, in our time, that killed worldwide 25 million people.
Not only the residuals of that were, you know, lasted as long as the early 40s, 50s, and 60s.